when a drunk heckler stormed onto the stage at Shea Stadium and challenged the Beatles in front of 55,000 screaming fans, security rushed to tackle him. But what John Lennon did next stopped everyone dead in their tracks. In that moment, the four superstars made a split-second decision that would transform not just the heckler's life, but create one of the most powerful and unexpected moments in rock history. But what could the Beatles have possibly said to a hostile stranger that turned an entire stadium from chaos into something so moving that people still talk about it 60 years later? The summer heat of August 15th, 1965 pressed down on Shea Stadium like a heavy blanket, but inside the concrete bowl, electricity crackled through the air with an intensity that made the temperature irrelevant. 55,000 voices merged into a single deafening roar that threatened to shake the very foundation of the massive stadium. The band had arrived in America just hours earlier, their plane touching down to scenes that defied belief. Thousands of screaming fans breaking through police barriers, grown men weeping, teenage girls fainting at the mere sight of their silhouettes through airplane windows. The limousine ride from the airport had been surreal. Windows tinted black to hide them from the crowds that lined every street, every overpass, every rooftop between JFK and Queens. Police motorcycles flanked them on all sides, their sirens wailing a mechanical harmony to the human chaos that followed in their wake. John had stared out at the blurred faces pressed against barriers, wondering when exactly they had stopped being four lads from Liverpool and become something else entirely. Symbols, perhaps, or gods, or prisoners of their own impossible success. Now, as they walked through the tunnel beneath Shea Stadium, the sound above them was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It wasn't just noise, it was pure, concentrated human emotion given voice. The concrete walls pulsed with the collective energy of an entire generation expressing itself through screams, chants, and tears. Roadies rushed past them carrying equipment, their faces tense with the knowledge that this performance would either cement the Beatles' legend or expose the impossibility of living up to their own mythology. John Lennon adjusted his guitar strap and glanced at Paul, who was unconsciously tapping out rhythms on his bass. George Harrison stared straight ahead, his jaw set with the kind of determination that masked deep uncertainty. Behind them, Ringo Starr twirled his drumsticks with nervous energy, the familiar motion providing the only comfort in this moment of controlled chaos. They had played to big crowds before, but nothing had prepared them for the sheer scale of what waited above. The stadium lights blazed down like artificial suns, creating stark shadows that danced across the makeshift stage. Police officers lined the barriers, their faces tense with the knowledge that they were barely containing something that could explode at any moment. In the sea of faces stretching endlessly in every direction, individual expressions blurred together, mouths open in perpetual screams, hands reaching desperately toward the stage, tears streaming down cheeks flushed with excitement and disbelief. But there was something else in that crowd, energy that cut against the grain of pure adoration. Near the front section, a figure moved with different energy, aggressive, confrontational, pushing roughly past the tightly packed bodies of devoted fans. His clothes were dishevelled, his movements unsteady but purposeful. While everyone else pressed forward with love and admiration, this man moved with something darker, something that challenged the very magic happening around him. John and his bandmates stepped onto the stage, and the roar became something beyond human comprehension. It was as if the stadium itself had found its voice, as if 55,000 individual souls had merged into a single creature capable of producing sound that transcended anything natural or expected. John approached his microphone, the familiar weight of his Rickenbacker guitar both comforting and daunting. But 30 minutes earlier, behind the carefully constructed facade of Beatlemania's biggest night, lay four young men grappling with pressures that no amount of success could have prepared them for. John Lennon sat in the makeshift dressing room beneath the stadium, pressing his palms against his temples as another wave of pain shot through his skull. The migraines had been getting worse with each city, each crowd, each impossible expectation placed upon their shoulders. He had taken 3 aspirin already, but the throbbing matched the rhythm of the crowd's distant roar, a constant reminder that failure was not an option. Paul McCartney stood before a cracked mirror, practicing his smile, the one that had graced 1,000 magazine covers, the one that convinced the world that being the most famous person on the planet was nothing but pure joy. But the reflection staring back at him showed the truth. Dark circles under his eyes from weeks of sleepless nights, the slight tremor in his hands that came from too much coffee and too little rest, the weight of being the band's diplomatic face when all he wanted was to write songs and make music that people could actually hear over their own screaming. George Harrison sat in the corner, methodically tuning his guitar for the 5th time in 10 minutes, knowing full well that it wouldn't matter. The stadium's acoustics were so poor, the crowd noise so overwhelming, that half their performance would be lost in the chaos. At 22, he was already feeling like a musical prisoner, trapped in a success that seemed to move further away from actual music with each passing show. The spiritual searching that was beginning to define him felt impossible to explore when every moment was scheduled, managed, and performed for an audience that wanted the Beatles they knew, not the men they were becoming. Ringo Starr watched his bandmates with quiet concern, recognizing the signs of stress that had become their constant companions. As the drummer, he could feel the rhythm of their collective exhaustion, the way their natural timing was being affected by the relentless pace of fame. He had joined this band to make music with friends, but friendship felt like a luxury they could no longer afford. Every conversation was either about business or performance, every private moment interrupted by obligations that stretched endlessly into the future. The weight of expectation pressed down on all of them like a physical force. They weren't just 4 musicians anymore, they were symbols, representatives of a cultural shift they hadn't asked to lead. Every word they spoke was analysed, every gesture interpreted as a statement about youth, rebellion, or the future of music. The irony was crushing. They had achieved everything they had dreamed of, yet felt more trapped than ever before. In 30 minutes they would walk onto that stage and deliver magic to 55,000 people. But first they had to find a way to remember why they had wanted to make music in the first place. The distant sound of the crowd served as both inspiration and warning. Out there waited either their greatest triumph or their most public failure, and none of them were entirely sure which it would be. The opening chords of Twist and Shout rang out across Shea Stadium, but even as they played, something was wrong. Even through the wall of screaming fans, John could sense a disturbance rippling through the front sections like a stone thrown into still water. The security guards along the barrier were moving with sudden urgency, their radios crackling with tense communications that were lost in the overwhelming noise. Paul continued playing, his bass line steady and reliable, but his eyes had found the source of the commotion. A man in a wrinkled shirt and loosened tie was forcing his way through the crowd with the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. The drunk Heckler's voice cut through even the Beatles' amplified music, a harsh challenge that sliced through the euphoric atmosphere like a blade. "You're frauds," he shouted, his words slurred but his anger crystal clear. "Talentless pretty boys! Show us what you've really got!" The crowd around him tried to silence him, their protective instincts toward their heroes kicking in, but the man was beyond reason, beyond shame, driven by emotions deeper than mere alcohol or jealousy. Security converged on him like a practiced dance, but the heckler was surprisingly agile despite his intoxicated state. He ducked under grasping hands, pushed past bodies, and with one final surge of desperate energy, he broke through the barrier and stumbled onto the sacred space of the stage itself. The music stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. George's guitar fell silent mid-chord, Paul's bass line died away, and even Ringo's steady beat faltered into nothing. 55,000 voices that had been screaming in ecstasy suddenly shifted to gasps of shock and confusion. The silence that followed was more deafening than any noise they had created. In that moment of suspended reality, everyone in the stadium, from the nosebleed seats to the VIP boxes, held their breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented violation of the Beatles' space would unfold. The heckler stood center stage, swaying slightly, his face flushed with alcohol and rage. "Come on then," he challenged, his voice now carrying clearly through the stadium sound system as he grabbed John's microphone stand. "Let's see what you're made of without all the screaming girls to hide behind." His eyes were wild with anguish that went beyond simple drunkenness. There was deep hurt there, raw pain that had found its target in these 4 young men who represented everything he felt he had lost or never had. John Lennon stood frozen, his Rickenbacker still hanging from his shoulder, processing what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The Beatles were untouchable on stage, protected by barriers both physical and mystical, yet here was a complete stranger, not just challenging their music, but their very right to exist in this elevated space. Security guards rushed toward the stage from all directions, their intentions clear. This man would be removed with whatever force was necessary. But in that split second before action became inevitable, recognition passed between the Heckler and the four Beatles, understanding perhaps, or mutual acknowledgement. The man wasn't just drunk and disorderly, he was broken, lost, using his final moment in the spotlight to scream about wounds much deeper than musical talent. The stadium held its breath, poised between chaos and resolution, waiting to see whether this moment would end in violence or something entirely unexpected. John Lennon raised his hand, and the world seemed to stop. The gesture was small, almost casual, but it carried such authority that the advancing security guards actually slowed their approach. The Heckler stood there, still swaying, still angry, but now looking confused by the lack of immediate retaliation. In the vast silence of the stadium, John's voice came through the microphone system, calm and measured in a way that felt impossible given the circumstances. "Hold on," he said, his Liverpool accent carrying clearly to every corner of Shea Stadium. "Just hold on a minute." He looked directly at the man who had invaded their stage, really looked at him, seeing past the drunkenness and the aggression to pain raw and human underneath. "What's your name, then?" The question seemed to deflate the Heckler's rage like air escaping from a balloon. He blinked, swayed, and for a moment looked like he might collapse entirely. "Danny," he mumbled into the microphone he was still clutching. "Danny Morrison." The name echoed through the stadium, transforming him from a faceless troublemaker into a real person with an identity, a story, a reason for being there. Paul stepped forward, his bass still strapped across his shoulder, and gently guided Danny to sit on the edge of the stage platform. "You all right, Danny?" he asked, his voice carrying the genuine concern that had made him the diplomatic heart of the Beatles. From somewhere, perhaps a roadie, perhaps his own pocket, he produced a bottle of water and handed it to the man. The gesture was so natural, so human, that it reminded everyone in the stadium that despite their fame, the Beatles were still just four young men capable of simple kindness. George began playing again, but not one of their songs. Instead, his fingers found a gentle, improvised melody that floated through the stadium like a musical embrace. The sound was contemplative, healing, nothing like the explosive rock and roll the crowd had come to hear. Ringo joined in with the softest brushwork, creating a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat rather than a driving force. "Tell us about it, Danny," John said, crouching down to be at eye level with the man. "What's really going on?" And somehow, impossibly, in front of 55,000 people, Danny Morrison began to talk. His words were halting, broken by emotion and alcohol, but the story that emerged was heartbreakingly universal. He had lost his job at the factory, his wife had left him, his kids wouldn't speak to him, and seeing these four successful young men living his dreams while his own life crumbled had triggered desperate rage inside him. The crowd listened in complete silence as this stranger's pain was laid bare on their stage. But what happened next transformed the moment from spectacle to a sacred moment. Instead of having Danny removed, the Beatles simply stayed with him. John shared a story about his own father leaving. Paul talked about the pressure of always having to be strong. George spoke quietly about feeling lost despite having everything. And Ringo just listened with the kind of attention that made someone feel truly heard. When Danny finally stood up, helped by Paul's steadying hand, he was no longer the same man who had stormed the stage. The anger was gone, replaced by an expression that looked like wonder. He handed the microphone back to John, nodded to each of the Beatles in turn, and walked quietly toward the security guards, who now seemed more like escorts than captors. As he disappeared into the wings, John returned to his microphone and said simply, "Sometimes we all need someone to listen." Then they launched into Help, the song taking on new meaning, the melody emerging spontaneously as if the moment had created its own perfect soundtrack. 55,000 people sang along with new understanding, united not by fandom but by shared humanity, creating a moment that would be remembered not as the night a drunk man disrupted a concert, but as the night the Beatles reminded the world that compassion could transform anyone, anywhere, at any time.